For most of the world, Vince Neil has always seemed untouchable. Decades of chaos, excess, and self-destruction never managed to slow him down. He survived an era that buried countless rock stars. He became the voice of rebellion, the soundtrack of nights people barely remember but never forget. To fans, Vince Neil wasn't just a singer. He was proof that some men simply outlive the consequences of their choices. But behind that myth is a truth far quieter, far more unsettling, and far more human. When Vince Neil recently hinted that he wanted it to end, many assumed it was another round of rock and roll theatrics. Some blamed scandals. Others blamed criticism, bad press, or exhaustion. But none of those explanations touched the real reason. Because Vince Neil doesn't want it to end because he's tired of fame. He wants it to end because his body has finally stopped asking for permission. In late 2024, away from the noise of the media and the roar of the stage, Vince Neil suffered a stroke. There was no dramatic announcement, no carefully managed statement designed to protect an image. Just a sudden medical reality that shattered the illusion of invincibility he had lived inside for decades. One side of his body weakened. Balance became uncertain. Movements that once came naturally now required focus, effort, and patience. Recovery wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. It was humbling. For a man whose entire identity was built on movement, stamina, and presence, that moment changed everything. Because a stroke doesn't just attack the body, it attacks the story you tell yourself about who you are. Vince Neil has never lived as a man who slows down. His career, his reputation, even his survival depended on momentum. But suddenly, time wasn't something he could outrun anymore. And that realization planted a thought he had avoided his entire life. What happens when the stage no longer forgives you? The cruel truth about fame is that it freezes you in the past. Fans don't see the person aging in front of them. They see a memory they refuse to let grow old. For Vince Neil, that memory is inseparable from Mötley Crüe, from sold-out arenas, screaming crowds, and a voice that once cut through walls of sound with ease. But the audience doesn't measure today against reality. They measure it against nostalgia. And nostalgia is merciless. Every breathless moment becomes a clip. Every missed note becomes proof. Every imperfect night becomes a verdict. Vince has watched it happen to other legends. Men who stayed just a little too long, long enough for admiration to turn into pity. He understands something fans rarely admit. The fall doesn't come when you stop performing. It comes when people start saying you should have stopped sooner. That fear weighs heavier than any criticism. Because Vince Neil doesn't fear disappearing. He fears being remembered the wrong way. Behind the scenes, the pressure hasn't eased. The band that once felt like a brotherhood has been strained by legal battles, public disputes, and internal fractures. What used to be about music now involves lawyers, contracts, and control. When something that once gave you life starts draining it instead, the question changes. It's no longer how long you can keep going, it's why you're still going at all. And recovering from a stroke forces that question into the open. Vince knows that every time he steps on stage now, he isn't just performing songs. He's performing strength. He's performing health. He's performing a version of himself that the world demands, but his body may no longer sustain. Rock and roll has never been kind to fragility. The moment vulnerability becomes visible, the narrative shifts from celebration to countdown. So when Vince Neil says he wants it to end, what he's really saying is this. He wants to choose the ending before the ending chooses him. Not out of defeat, but out of control. Control over his legacy. Control over the final image fans carry with them. Control over whether his story closes with dignity or decline. After surviving decades of excess, addiction, loss, and chaos, it wasn't scandal that finally slowed Vince Neil down. It was time. Time stripping away the illusion of invincibility. Time forcing a man who lived loudly to confront silence. Time asking a question no legend ever wants to face. When does holding on stop being bravery and start becoming denial? That is the real reason Vince Neil wants it to end. The hardest part isn't admitting that time has caught up. The hardest part is realizing that the world doesn't slow down with you. For Vince Neil, the silence between shows has become louder than the applause ever was. In the past, silence meant rest before the next city, the next crowd, the next surge of noise. Now, silence has a different weight. It's filled with questions that were easy to ignore when adrenaline did all the talking. Questions about memory, about dignity, about whether continuing is still an act of passion or just habit dressed up as loyalty. There's a myth in rock culture that stopping equals failure, that real legends die on stage, mic in hand, refusing to quit. But Vince Neil has lived long enough to see how that myth ends for most people. Not with glory, but with footage that circulates without mercy. Clips stripped of context. Voices judged against recordings made decades earlier. Bodies compared to memories that never age. What scares him now isn't criticism. It's erosion. Legacy doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes slowly, moment by moment, performance by performance, until the story changes without you realizing it has. Vince understands that once the narrative shifts from he's still doing it to why is he still doing this, there's no way back. And that shift doesn't care how much you once meant to people. There's also a loneliness that comes with aging in a world that only celebrates youth. When you're young and reckless, excess looks romantic. When you're older and recovering, the same excess becomes evidence. Evidence people use to explain your decline instead of acknowledging your humanity. Vince Neil knows how quickly empathy turns into judgment. Inside Mötley Crüe, the atmosphere has changed too. Brotherhood has given way to boundaries. Trust has been replaced by contracts. Even victories feel administrative. And when music becomes something you defend instead of something you feel, the soul of it starts slipping through your fingers. There is a moment every long-surviving artist reaches where they realize the stage is no longer a place of escape. It becomes a mirror, one that reflects not who you were at your peak, but who you are right now. For Vince, that mirror has become impossible to ignore. Each show demands more from a body that is still healing. Each appearance asks him to prove strength instead of share joy. He doesn't want sympathy. He doesn't want a farewell soaked in tears and tributes. What he wants is something far rarer in the world of fame: agency. The right to decide when enough is enough. The right to stop before the story turns cruel. The right to leave people wanting one more moment instead of wishing he had left sooner. And perhaps the most painful realization of all is this: walking away doesn't mean the music stops living. It means the music survives without being asked to carry a man beyond his limits. Vince Neil understands that legends don't vanish when they stop. They vanish when they refuse to. So when he talks about wanting it to end, he isn't talking about death. He isn't talking about despair. He's talking about preservation. Preserving what remains of his strength. Preserving the memory fans hold on to. Preserving himself in a world that has taken so much already. In the end, the bravest act for someone who built a career on never slowing down might be choosing to stop. Not because he can't go on, but because he finally understands what continuing would cost. They're the moment that arrives quietly for artists who have lived too long in the spotlight. A moment no applause can drown out. It comes late at night, long after the crowds are gone, when the body aches in ways adrenaline can no longer mask. For Vince Neil, that moment has become familiar. And with it comes a clarity he never allowed himself to have before. Fame taught Vince how to survive chaos, but it never taught him how to stop. For years, stopping meant losing relevance. It meant becoming a headline written in the past tense. It meant being replaced. But now, after everything his body has endured, stopping has taken on a different meaning. It no longer feels like surrender. It feels like honesty. What few people understand is that continuing can sometimes be the more selfish choice. Continuing asks the audience to pretend nothing has changed. It asks the body to absorb damage silently. It asks the mind to ignore fear and push forward because expectation demands it. Vince Neil has reached the point where that bargain no longer feels fair. There's also grief in this realization. Grief for the version of himself that could do this forever. Grief for the nights when singing felt effortless and the future felt endless. Aging doesn't just take strength, it takes certainty. And once certainty is gone, every decision becomes heavier. Every tour becomes a question mark instead of a promise. Within Mötley Crüe, the weight of history presses harder than ever. The band is no longer just four men making noise. It's a legacy protected by expectations. Every move is analyzed. Every choice is dissected. And Vince knows that legacies don't usually collapse with a single mistake. They fade through 1,000 small compromises. He has seen what happens when artists ignore the warning signs, when they confuse loyalty with obligation, when they believe the audience needs them more than they need themselves. The ending, almost always, is crueler than the beginning. And Vince has no desire to become a cautionary tale disguised as entertainment. What he wants now is something simple, yet radical in a culture built on excess: peace. Peace in knowing he didn't push past the point of truth. Peace in knowing he didn't ask his body for something it could no longer give. Peace in knowing that when people remember his voice, they remember power, not struggle. The irony is that stepping away may be the most rock and roll decision he's ever made. Not because it's loud, but because it's defiant. Defiant against an industry that rewards endurance over well-being. Defiant against a narrative that demands legends burn out publicly instead of choosing their exit quietly. Vince Neil understands now that endings don't erase what came before. They frame it. They decide whether the story closes with respect or regret. And after a lifetime of living on the edge, perhaps the most meaningful legacy he can leave behind is not another performance, but the courage to say, "This is enough." And that is why he wants it to end. Not because the music failed him, but because he finally chose himself. As Vince Neil contemplates his future, there's an undeniable weight in the decision he faces. Walking away isn't an act of weakness, it's an act of strength. The strength to face the truth of his body's limitations and the truth of the narrative he has been living. Every artist, no matter how legendary, must eventually ask themselves, what am I leaving behind? Vince has seen too many peers continue long past their prime, chasing a glory that no longer exists. He's watched as the spark that once made them giants flickered out, leaving behind only the echoes of their former selves. For those who stayed too long, their final chapters were written by the audience, the media, and the fans, rather than by their own hands. That fear has loomed over Vince for years. It's the fear of becoming irrelevant, the fear of being remembered for the wrong reasons. And it's a fear that many rock stars know intimately, because in a world obsessed with youth and perfection, there is little room for the cracks and imperfections of age. But as Vince takes stock of where he is now, he realizes that his legacy is not bound to the number of tours, albums, or even performances he gives. It's bound to the mark he leaves on the world. And the world still remembers the impact Mötley Crüe had in shaping rock music. It's that impact, that undeniable presence in the annals of rock history, that gives Vince the peace he seeks. Stepping away from the stage is not giving up. It's taking ownership of his own story. It's taking the final step toward the peace he's been craving. It's understanding that leaving the spotlight on his own terms is more valuable than staying in it just for the sake of it. Vince Neil's choice to step away might not be a loud, dramatic exit. It will likely be quiet, personal, and full of reflection. The kind of exit that honors his past without relying on it for validation. The kind of exit that allows him to live the rest of his life without the weight of public expectation pushing him further than he can go. This ending doesn't diminish what Vince has accomplished, it honors it. It allows him to leave behind a legacy of a man who chose to stop before the music turned into noise. It allows fans to remember Vince as they always did, as he was at his best, the frontman of one of the most iconic bands in rock history. His exit will be his last act of defiance against the machine that tried to keep him going for its own benefit. As Vince prepares to face this next chapter, he may not have all the answers, but for the first time in years, he's choosing them for himself. And that choice, no matter how quiet it is, will echo louder than any final performance ever could. Vince Neil may be ready to say goodbye to the stage, but that doesn't mean his story is over. It's just moving into its next phase, a phase that will be written not with the roar of a crowd, but with the peace of knowing when it's time to step back. This may be Vince Neil's greatest performance yet, the courage to walk away. The legacy Vince Neil leaves behind will not be defined by his final decision to walk away. It will be defined by the monumental impact he and Mötley Crüe had on the rock world. From the raw energy of their live shows to the iconic anthems that still echo through arenas, Vince's voice will forever be synonymous with an era that reshaped music. It's an era that will live on, no matter when or how he steps off the stage. For the fans, Vince Neil is more than a performer. He's an enduring figure who was part of a cultural revolution. His voice, his presence, the way Mötley Crüe turned music into an event. These things cannot be erased, even as he steps away from the spotlight. There's something powerful in the knowledge that he is leaving while he still commands respect, while his influence is felt. Rather than hanging on for too long, waiting for the inevitable erosion of his legacy, Vince has chosen to preserve it, to protect what made him great from being diluted by time and circumstance. The public narrative may shift. The headlines may change. But Vince's place in history is secure. Mötley Crüe's music will continue to inspire new generations, and Vince's voice will remain iconic as a symbol of the excess, defiance, and unapologetic attitude that defined rock and roll for decades. By choosing to end things on his own terms, Vince Neil isn't just making a decision for himself. He's making a decision for his legacy. He's ensuring that the story of his career remains powerful, unmarred by the slow fading that many rock stars face. His decision is a reflection of the ultimate respect for the music, for the fans, and for the artist he once was and still is. Vince will forever be the man who helped define an era of rock music, and his legacy will carry on in the hearts of millions of fans worldwide. As Mötley Crüe's music continues to pump through speakers, as new generations discover their albums and videos, Vince Neil's impact will live on, transcending the years and the changing face of the music industry. And in a world that often forgets, that's the true power of walking away, ensuring your legacy remains intact, not as something that fades into memory, but as something that stays vital and relevant. By knowing when to end, Vince Neil has made sure that his story isn't one of decline. It's one of enduring relevance, always remembered for the wild ride he gave the world and for knowing when to stop, keeping that legend alive for years to come. The real reason Vince Neil wants it to end isn't just about stepping off the stage. It's about respecting his legacy, about ensuring the end is as memorable as the beginning. The choice to end now, to step out of the limelight before the world can turn its gaze away, is the ultimate act of love for the music that made him. In his own way, Vince Neil has already given the world one final, beautiful performance. The performance of knowing when it's time to walk away, leaving a legacy that will forever be remembered in the halls of rock history. As Vince Neil steps into this new chapter, there is something undeniably powerful about his decision. It's not just a decision to retire or fade into the background, but a decision to maintain his narrative, his authentic narrative, on his own terms. No one can deny that Vince Neil has lived through the chaos and extremes that most people only dream of. The world has seen him rise to unimaginable heights and endure the deepest lows, all while carrying the weight of an era on his shoulders. And while many might think that walking away is a symbol of surrender, for Vince, it is exactly the opposite. It's a display of power to control his future, his image, and ultimately, his legacy. By choosing to step back from the stage now, Vince has ensured that his legacy won't be clouded by the inevitable descent that happens when an artist continues for too long. He's choosing to leave while he's still celebrated, while the sound of his voice is still iconic, and while Mötley Crüe's music still brings people together. This decision isn't easy. It's not about running away from the spotlight or hiding from the inevitable changes in the music industry. It's about respecting the work, respecting the craft. Vince knows that staying in the limelight too long would eventually tarnish what he's worked so hard for, and he's making sure to preserve it. He's learned, perhaps, what every great artist must. There's an end to everything, but the end doesn't have to be ugly. The end doesn't have to be remembered with disappointment or pity. Vince Neil, the rock star, is stepping away not because he can't keep going, but because he wants to make sure people remember him for the man he truly is. One who could make the difficult choice to bow out gracefully before it was forced upon him. His decision allows him to keep his dignity intact, his impact powerful, and his music cherished. For fans who grew up with Mötley Crüe blasting through speakers, for those who experienced their electrifying performances live, this decision might be bittersweet. But they could take solace in the fact that Vince Neil has given everything he could to his fans. His voice, his music, his presence in the world of rock will never be erased. And what better way to honor that than by stepping away at the height of his career, leaving behind the kind of legacy that makes people remember not just the highs, but the very essence of rock and roll. As the world of music evolves, and as new faces take the stage, Vince Neil's influence will live on. His voice, his energy, and the unforgettable moments he created with Mötley Crüe will forever be part of the soundtrack of rock history. Vince may have decided to walk away, but he will always be a part of the fabric of rock and roll, woven into the memories of fans and the history books alike. And perhaps in the end, that's what makes his decisions so rock and roll. Choosing to leave when it matters most, and ensuring that his story is told on his own terms, forever etched into the legacy he built. This is Vince Neil's true final act, the act of leaving behind a legend that will never fade. As Vince Neil prepares to step away, it's clear that this decision was never made lightly. The man who once stood in front of thousands, who lived through the most wild and chaotic days of rock and roll, now stands at crossroads of legacy and self-preservation. He's not walking away out of weakness or exhaustion. Rather, he's walking away because he knows the value of knowing when to stop. Vince Neil is setting his own terms for what happens next. And in a world where so many have their story dictated by others, by the fans, by the media, by the critics, Vince is making sure that his narrative ends with dignity and respect. It's not just the fans who will miss him. It's the industry, too. For decades, Vince was at the forefront of rock's golden era, alongside his bandmates in Mötley Crüe, shaping what rock and roll looked like for an entire generation. He was there when the genre was at its peak, and now, even as the world of music continues to evolve, his legacy remains a cornerstone of that era. But even legends like Vince realize that staying in the spotlight longer than necessary can tarnish what they've built. The rock world doesn't care for the frailties of time, but Vince does. He knows that in the long run, the greatest gift he can give to his fans and to himself is to preserve the very essence of what made him a star. Every era in music eventually has to make way for the next, and Vince Neil's era was one of the most transformative in rock history. He was part of something monumental. Mötley Crüe didn't just create music, they defined a lifestyle, a generation, a movement. It's impossible to listen to their iconic albums without feeling the power of their influence. For many fans, Vince Neil was the voice of a wild, unapologetic freedom that is so deeply intertwined with the essence of rock music itself. But even for icons like Vince, there comes a time when it's more respectful to step aside, leaving the legacy intact rather than watching it slowly diminish over time. Vince knows better than anyone that rock is not just about the music, it's about the moments, the energy, the raw emotion that drives the fans wild. He understands that leaving at the height of his legacy, at a time when his voice still resonates, will ensure that the memories of his performances, his energy, and his presence will never be forgotten. The way Mötley Crüe shook up the music world with their electrifying performances and boundary-pushing style is something that will never fade. And Vince knows this better than anyone, because he was the driving force behind much of it. The road ahead may be quieter, less chaotic, and without the constant rush of the stage. But Vince Neil is about to experience something that many people who live their lives in the limelight never do: the peace of knowing when to end on top. This decision is not a retreat, but a recognition of his own power. Power to choose his exit, power to leave on his own terms. He is reclaiming his story, ensuring that he's remembered for the impact he made and for the man he truly is, rather than the man time and circumstances try to mold him into. Vince Neil's greatest act of defiance may not be in the loud, rebellious energy he brought to the stage for years. It may not even be in the music he created with Mötley Crüe. His final defiance is choosing to walk away at a time when he knows he can still leave the stage with pride, before the music becomes something he has to fight to keep. In the end, Vince Neil's decision to step away will stand as one of the most rock and roll things he has ever done. Not because he's quitting, but because he's choosing when to step off the stage, leaving behind a legacy that will continue to reverberate for years to come. And that, in itself, is the true power of knowing when to say goodbye.